Brace yourself.
I'm a strong advocate for mechanics that highlight the joy of motion, freely exploring the world with grace, fluidity, and energy. A game that commands its movement confidently, one that makes the simplest of motions feel satisfying, is one that I'll remember long after it's over. But when a game throws a curveball when it comes to exploring its space, I can't help but pay attention. Gravity Rush is probably the freshest approach to exploring a 3D game space I've seen in ages. It's the joy of motion in a different light. Originally debuting on the PlayStation Vita, Gravity Rush stars Kat, an amnesiac who discovers she has the ability to change and control gravitational forces. Awakening in the city of Hexville, the young heroine encounters her power spontaneously and gets wrapped up in a government conspiracy that threatens the very world itself. Along the way, she meets other characters, most notably her rival-turned-ally, Raven. It's a charming but dramatic world that Kat explores, but the series' signature gravity manipulation mechanic is what threw it to the forefront of Sony's franchise library. The series has since netted a sequel in Gravity Rush 2, which expanded upon the Vita-confined debut considerably. In this video, I'll be looking at both Gravity Rush 1 and 2. Specifically, I'll be looking at the PlayStation 4 remaster of Gravity Rush 1, along with Gravity Rush 2 on PlayStation 4. So before we dive into the design of the Gravity Rush series, here's today's thesis. Gravity Rush uses its signature gravity mechanic for a movement-focused purpose, deriving a constantly changing perspective. It overcomes the hurdles of its viewpoint with tight design and a difficulty curve that complements the mechanic. Gravity manipulation is not an uncommon mechanic for video games, but Gravity Rush uses it in a way I've never seen before. Most games that use the shifting of gravity have been puzzle games or platformers. These games use the changing perspective to force the player to look at a level in a different way. By changing an angle or axes, gravity can alter basic level structure, causing a stage to look differently than it did before, deriving challenge through altered viewpoints. However, these are done in pretty passive states. They're used for the purpose of forcing a change in perception, but that's usually the lengths of it. It rarely changes the player's velocity, acceleration, and overall movement. Gravity Rush, on the other hand, uses the changing gravity for a more action-focused purpose. Changing gravity hurls Kat in a specific direction, leaving her in a state of pseudo-freefall. The movement isn't meant to feel precise, as Kat normally spreads her arms and legs out as if she's plummeting from a great height, not elegantly soaring through the air, at least in the first game. This level of control must be earned over time with practice, but once the mechanics are under belt, the player can easily shift gravity to swerve around a tower, or slingshot upwards and land on their feet. Really, Gravity Rush uses gravity manipulation to create spectacle, accelerating the perceptive nature that other games provide, and heightening fast-paced action set pieces. But Gravity Rush's most unique element is directly tied to the gravity shifting mechanic, and it's an element that really defines the kind of game Gravity Rush is. The way you change gravity is done by aiming at a specific direction and initiating the shifting command. Where you aim determines what is considered down, what direction you will fall toward. Based on this, Gravity Rush's use of gravity shifting has more in common with shooters than it does with your typical 3D action game. You spend much of your time pointing and shooting Kat in a specific direction. Well, that introduces a whole nother hurdle that Gravity Rush must overcome, one that, for the most part, it handles extremely well. Since you're using an aim and shoot setup to determine the gravitational force, you're always going to need to point the camera in a direction you want to travel to. What this implies is that the camera is almost always going to be moving in a direction other than the default gravity. Gravity Rush's camera then becomes a reliance. If the player is unable to entirely perceive and interact with the game space around them, then navigation will become uncontrollable and player hostile. This is the greatest challenge that Gravity Rush as a series must overcome, using a mechanic that forces an ever-changing perspective. From the beginning, these controls are intimidating. Changing gravity is not intuitive from the start, neither in Gravity Rush 1 or 2, so learning the ins and outs of the mechanic has its share of growing pains. In Gravity Rush 1, your initial hub size is actually pretty small, and it's not until later in the game that more sections of the city are opened up. This first hub also has plenty of narrow passages, which is an environment that doesn't really work with the mechanic, under initial examination anyway. Claustrophobic areas are an easy way to destroy camera control, but Gravity Rush instead uses these as a way for the player to gauge perspective. Right side up is easy to determine in these environments, so it's that initial stepping stone for the player to easily learn about the game's free-flowing camera without taking the training wheels off too early. These alleyways and closed quarters actually serve the purpose of giving the player a baseline to easily understand the default perspective, even as it shifts. It's that neutral positioning that keeps the player from losing the point of reference. But as the player practices the techniques, learning to preemptively eye the camera, the mechanic starts to become less intimidating. And as this happens, the areas begin to open up. The cramped alleyways shift to spacious rift planes and later segments through the gravity pillar. The open areas often require fast changes in camera perspective with gravity shifting, but the player is able to take the dizzying, obtuse scenes and gel with them. Aerial battles move from stop-and-go confrontations to what feel like dogfights, dashing back and forth and slingshotting around landmarks. In fact, combat, as frenetic and dizzying as it is the fastest and easiest way to associate the player with a constantly shifting perspective. It's fast and snappy, thanks to a generous lock-on system, and I can't help but be engrossed with this sense of visual flow. Even better, upgrades throughout the game increase the player's speed and gravity energy, so the player spends more and more time using the gravity shifting mechanic, soaring through the air, and seeing from off-kilter viewpoints. The player's skill progresses with new levels and new practice, and the game environments and systems evolve along with them. Eventually, the player can fully adapt to the new areas. What was originally a stiff and intimidating mechanic becomes a fluid demonstration of aerial acrobatics. The topsy-turvy camera steadily becomes less of a liability, and the player eventually doesn't need to know what down is. This is pretty impressive, taking a gameplay mechanic so obtuse and turning it into something that feels natural. It's a brilliant way to accommodate the player fluidly and progressively, which is something that I found Gravity Rush 2 to lack. While the world does open up over time, it's clear that Gravity Rush 2 wants the player to have played the first game beforehand. The initial hub is incredibly spacious, and while I find it to be a great way to associate the player with such a bizarre camera system, it makes later hubs feel too generous in open space. The tightness of Gravity Rush's design allowed the player to learn the ropes bit by bit, but Gravity Rush 2 favors scope over tight design. Don't get me wrong, Gravity Rush 2 does keep the gravity shifting mechanic intact, but it just makes its skill curve seem a bit less honed than the first, thanks to environments that don't really build with the player's skill from beginner to expert. The seamlessness of player progression is why I find Gravity Rush's design to be so inventive. It's very challenging to accommodate a constantly shifting camera system to the player, but Gravity Rush is a series that totally understands the challenge at work. It broadens its design in tandem with the player's skill development, introducing a more expansive world as the player accustoms themselves to the controls and camera. Enemies and challenges take advantage of the free-flowing traversal, peppering the stages with over-the-top aerial action that, by the end of the game, doesn't feel as obtrusive as in the beginning. It's the initial impenetrability of its main mechanic that really shows Gravity Rush's prowess. It's incredibly difficult to really nail what the developers were envisioning, and admittedly, Gravity Rush's movement still has a degree of looseness, even at the end game. But it shows the developer's skill in accommodation through challenge, crafting a world around a purposely disorienting perspective and making it feel, even for just an instant, as natural as walking on two legs.